I always begin these presentations with kind of reminding everybody about the need for all of these efforts. What is the imperative for decarbonization? What is the imperative for mitigation? And I always come back to the core science of it. The IPCC, the UN's climate science body, has just concluded its 6th assessment cycle. And it's concluded that almost 100% of global warming has been caused by human-driven activities like the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. And we need rapid, deep, and sustained mitigation and accelerated adaptation actions in order to protect the most vulnerable populations of the world from the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So the IPCC has suggested, the IPCC doesn't really prescribe, as they say, I guess they offer suggestions. They've said that greenhouse gas emissions were 54% higher in 2019 compared to 1990 levels. And we need to almost halve this in order to achieve the Paris Agreement's goals. So we need to cut global emissions by 43% by 2030 compared to 2019. So that's kind of the global top-down scientific push for all of these efforts, whether it's decarbonization, climate mitigation, setting up of carbon markets, and so on. If you look at some of the solutions that the IPCC has summarized in the 6th assessment cycle report, particularly for mitigation, the IPCC agrees that there is an entire menu of solutions, and even the presentations by previous speakers in terms of what the Indian government is doing shows that across sectors there are plenty of options available to achieve our mitigation goals globally. So the IPCC has said that solutions are available at affordable costs, but there are definitely some regional variations. We've seen some dramatic changes over the past decade or so on a per unit cost basis. Solar energy has dropped 85%, wind by 55%, and lithium-ion batteries by 85%. These are global figures. Regionally, the numbers vary. But the most important part is that these mitigation and decarbonization solutions globally are technically viable, they are becoming increasingly cost-effective, and are generally supported by the public, all of which are very important and necessary for them to be deployed at a large scale and in many regions. So with that, we come to where we are right now. So recently COP28 concluded, and from the perspective of decarbonization policy, there were some kind of earth-shattering trends, at least for people working in this very niche space of climate policy who get excited about these things. The global stocktake, which concluded at COP28, which was like a report card of what progress we have made on the Paris Agreement's goals. The global stocktake final decision text recognized for the first time that fossil fuels play a role in climate change. And this sounds bizarre. I mean, scientists have been talking about this for decades. We've known even as lay people, civil society. But the fact is that the COP is a unique space where about 200 countries have to agree on every single word that is put in decision text. So for 200 countries to recognize that yes, fossil fuels are the problem, and we need to actually transition away from them in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, this was definitely a big milestone. There were other milestones that were achieved. So the COP28 global stocktake decision text called for a tripling of global renewable energy capacity and doubling of the annual rate of energy efficiency efforts by 2030. So all of these are fairly positive from the perspective of this whole decarbonization imperative. This language was imperfect. We had a lot of concerns with a lot of the loopholes that have been put in place. For example, developed rich countries are dependent on natural gas, and natural gas has been included as a transitional fuel which allows a lot of rich countries to continue to use natural gas instead of rapidly shifting over to renewables. So there were a lot of problems with the text. But the fact is that this moment, this decision document from COP28 should now create pressure, further pressure for economies to further decarbonize their energy systems. Of course, in this process, the global north countries should take the lead. But the fact is that today global climate goals cannot be achieved without the participation of countries like India, China. The two countries alone account for about 40% of global emissions. So most of you are familiar with these stats, so I won't kind of spend a lot of time on this. India is a small contributor to the climate crisis. from a historical perspective, even today, despite being the most populous country, we are responsible for only 7% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So a small contributor to the problem, but we will be growing. Our energy demand is going to be growing exponentially. Population is growing. Our emissions will continue to grow. So India's participation in the global climate effort is crucial. Definitely kind of moderated through the lens of equity and climate justice. The latest 2019 greenhouse gas inventory for India kind of repeats what the previous inventory showed us, that electricity production is the biggest contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. Our heavy dependence on coal continues to be kind of our biggest challenge in decarbonizing our energy system. But opportunities to decarbonize exist across the different sectors that are listed here in the greenhouse gas inventory. So in terms of being a climate leader, a developing country that is taking its own lead in climate action, India is proactive. It doesn't kind of, we're not sitting back and doing nothing. We've set an ambitious NDC. We are making progress on the NDC goals, definitely. At COP forums, India takes the position of advocating for equity and CBDR, arguing that developed countries should take the lead in climate action, developing countries should get more carbon space to grow further. India has also been very resistant to taking on any particular sectoral targets or further top-down imposed targets on particular fuels, particular gases. The Indian delegation maintains the sanctity of the NDC. This is the amount of effort we've committed to, and beyond this would go against equity. That's kind of been their position. In terms of the current policy architecture for climate policy, we have kind of the top-down signal that is provided by our NDC, which is looking at emissions intensity, non-fossil power capacity, and the carbon sink. We have the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which has 8 national missions under which various action is advanced. The union budget also does budgetary allocations for various green growth and climate-related imperatives. And then we have the state action plans on climate change. But what we are keen to also bring attention to now is the fact that we need to have a clear sectoral mitigation strategy where we come up with coherent sectoral mitigation plans. So this is the next step that we think from a policy perspective the Indian government needs to make progress on. Just a simple sectoral mapping in terms of policies, this is not exhaustive. There are many other initiatives, actions, policies that are taking place in each sector. But we find that there is action happening in each sector. For the power sector, we are looking at efforts to decarbonize by scaling up renewable energy, by having RPOs for DISCOMs and other entities. For the industrial sector, a very difficult and hard to abate sector, we are setting up a domestic carbon market, though the full extent of that and the impact it will have on emissions is still out for judgment. For the transportation sector, there are a list of various schemes, so as the previous speaker kind of also listed out. What we need now is to convert these packages of policies for different sectors into coherent policy signals for each sector. We need to come up with bottom-up sectoral mitigation plans. And one of the blueprints has already kind of been set in this one document that the Ministry of Environment and Forest has prepared. It's called the LT-LEDS document. Some of you may be familiar. So countries who have set a carbon neutrality or net zero target to the UNFCCC under the Paris Agreement are required to come up with a policy document laying out how they will achieve their net zero target or carbon neutrality target. This is called the Long-Term Low Emission Development Strategy, or the LT-LEDS. This document essentially guides how a country plans to transition towards net zero across its different sectors. So in 2022, the Indian government went through this entire exercise. The exercise started prior to 2022 of preparing an LT-LEDS document. There were about 6 or 7 task forces that were set up, and CSE was part of one of the task forces on looking at industrial emissions. The LT-LEDS document looks at a number of different sectors such as power, transport, urbanization, industry. It also looks at specific niche scientific areas like carbon dioxide removal, forestry, and carbon sinks. Now, the difference between this and what we are proposing in terms of sectoral mitigation plans is that the LT-LEDS document is a long-term document. It has a long-term horizon till 2070. It also doesn't include clear targets, which is kind of the nature of a long-term target, of a long-term document like this. You want to just set out broad principles that you kind of refine over time. But having clear sectoral mitigation plans with short, medium, and long-term targets to complement this process would create the kind of coherent policy signal that I think even industry desires, that I think global investors desire. And these sectoral plans must speak to one another across the different silos of ministries to ensure coordinated efforts, because there is synergy between transportation climate mitigation policies and, let's say, your energy and power sector policies. There's a lot of synergies between the two. So the sectoral mitigation plans must speak to one another. So just a quick run through of why we should undertake this exercise for proactive sectoral planning. The first, of course, is climate vulnerability. According to the Ministry of Earth Sciences data, we have our surface air temperature has increased by 0.7 degrees Celsius between 1901 and 2018, which is huge at a continental scale. Climate and extreme weather events are increasing and are leading to increasing displacement of people, income losses, which are occurring today and are projected to rise even further. Some projections have said that India may lose around 3% of its GDP due to global warming, of even 1 degree over pre-industrial levels. This is CSE's own pioneering database on extreme weather events, in which this is designed by two of my colleagues, and they document every single extreme weather disaster that occurs annually across India from a range of different sources, and it's compiled and updated onto this online database. The latest analysis shows that India experienced extreme weather events on 86% of the days between January to June 2023. So this database and this report is now become popularly known as the Disaster a Day report, because it's showing that we're experiencing almost a disaster every day with increasing climate change and global warming. So our climate vulnerability is immense, and that is itself a strong imperative to proactively develop mitigation plans. Secondly, there are multiple co-benefits that come with proactively building out your sectoral planning. Whether you look at tackling air pollution through reduced dependence on thermal power, you look at avoiding the need for further adaptation or loss and damage compensation by undertaking proactive mitigation. We have power sector experts here who will talk more in depth about stranded asset risk, but definitely you don't want to end up with fossil fuel infrastructure which is not financially viable anymore. Undertaking proactive mitigation at a sectoral level will also reduce our exposure to volatility in fossil fuel markets, particularly for oil and gas. Trade and economic competitiveness is becoming a huge area. It's something that we are also quite focused on. We are seeing global trends today where rich and developed countries are giving huge subsidies for domestic green industry, whether it's through the US Inflation Reduction Act, the European Union Green Deal Industrial Plan. There is a risk that developing countries who don't work hard today in the short term to decarbonize their energy sectors, decarbonize manufacturing, they could fall behind in this global green race. We also have global trends in the form of carbon border adjustments, which the previous speaker spoke about. They could hit our steel export earnings by as much as 3%, as recent estimates have suggested. So if we don't work on decarbonizing our manufacturing starting today, we could have a lot of liabilities piling up and also have reduced economic competitiveness in the medium to long term. And lastly, we are also seeing the threat of a reduced sovereign credit rating due to lack of investment in climate action, due to higher climate risk and impacts from extreme weather events. One study has recently suggested that deferring green investments will increase cost of borrowing for nations. India is named as one of the countries at risk, and this could translate into higher costs of corporate debt. So this is something definitely that we could look to avoid. And lastly, proactive sectoral mitigation planning can also develop pathways that can then be used to identify where the financing gaps are, where the implementation gaps are, and where the technology gaps are. So, of course, international support and cooperation is a huge part in this equation. Once countries like India develop sectoral mitigation plans, they can then go to various multilateral forums, various global forums, and then demand the kind of international financing that we are due as developing countries. The burden of decarbonization, of course, should not be borne alone by emerging and developing economies who have contributed very little to the climate crisis. Even today, the financing needs far exceed the actual money that we are getting. So estimates suggest that we need 2.5 trillion US dollars to achieve our NDC alone. But currently, only about 1/4 of that is being financed. We're also seeing that we're getting inadequate climate finance from developed countries, which was set up under the Paris Agreement in the form of a $100 billion goal. A lot of the money that's coming in the form of climate finance is coming as loans and not grants, which is also a huge problem for developing countries. And a lot of global reports will tell you definitely that clean energy spending, clean tech spending has increased exponentially, but that is heavily concentrated. If you look at the graph on the right, most of the huge increases in clean energy spending today are happening in the US, in China, and the European Union. But other parts of the world, particularly the continent of Africa, South Asia, which includes India, and other vulnerable parts of the world are not getting enough clean energy investment. So all of this is definitely, these are crucial factors to consider. So lastly, in terms of how India can lead the way on this, in terms of being proactive with sectoral mitigation planning, we definitely think that while global climate deals are extremely important to guide global action, domestic strategies are going to put the achievement of those goals within reach. The Global South, particularly India, we must know where we are going in terms of climate action. We must know our own domestic strategies in accordance with our domestic imperatives. What this will also do is avoid the impact of top-down prescriptions when we talk about funding. So one example, many of you may have heard about JETPs, or Just Energy Transition Partnerships. It's a funding deal that has been offered by G7 countries to a number of coal-dependent economies in the Global South to decarbonize their energy sectors. But the JETP deals have been offered by rich developed countries to emerging economies on terms that are not favorable, not feasible for the recipient country. So about 4 countries are kind of in the middle of JETP negotiations right now. South Africa, Vietnam, Senegal, and Indonesia. 3 out of these 4 countries are heavily dependent on coal, and the terms that are being offered to them through these JETP deals are not favorable at all to the recipient countries. So to avoid situations like that, we should come up with our own proactive plans. And overall, the Global South needs design solutions and institutional interventions which can best be determined domestically. So we really need locally appropriate pathways in each sector, which will then be the guiding factor for the kind of global international support that we need. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.